have not introduced. Everyone knows Hans Christensen. Maybe he is the best, but he's a very well-known expert on nuclear weapons. And I give the floor to Hans to explain us the actual situation and the developments. Hans, the floor is to you.
Great, thanks very much. I hope everybody can hear me, otherwise flag me. Thanks for the invitation, and is the new way of doing things here. I would have preferred to travel somewhere, but here we are. So briefly, well, I've been asked to just give a very brief snapshot of the situation with nukes in Europe. So I'm going to use a few charts, and we can, ask questions and whatever we need to. And then I need to share a screen somehow. So let me see if I can get this going. You're not seeing anything yet, are you?
No.
Okay, let's see here. We go to Zoom, we share a screen. Where is it? Down here on the left. There. This one. And, okay, let's start with this one. So that's, of course, on the western side, so to speak. You're familiar with these maps, presumably, and we still have a situation where the United States has about 150 almost nuclear weapons in Europe. And, there are infrastructures on all these bases where you see red and gray here. The ones with red, of course, are the ones that have weapons present. Right now we're in the last phase of preparations for an upgrade of these systems. We expect the first new version of a nuclear bomb that's called the B6112 to come off the production line sometime next year. And after that, presumably, relatively quickly, be deployed to the bases in Europe. We are also seeing these countries that host these weapons upgrading their aircraft. Most of them are upgrading to the F-35. The Germans are trying to do it a little differently. They're trying to figure out right now if they should use an older version, modified, whatever. But so that point here is that it's in the middle of a new phase, and but the numbers have just steadily come down. And I anticipate they will continue to sort of trickle down in the years ahead, simply because of the fact that militarily this is not really that important. It's more there for symbolic reasons. Nonetheless, that's where we are. Do you see these two other maps that popped up?
No.
You don't see them? Let me see if I can switch to them. For some reason, I do not get. Now it's telling me that I'm not in the meeting, but you can obviously see me. Let's see here. Okay, so share this. Yeah, sure, let's just put this one on. Do you see anything now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. What I wanted to capture with this one was, that we are, a family of nuclear weapon states. So the NATO ones, you can see that I showed you on the left, but on this one, you can also see the French. We have French nuclear forces, of course, at several bases. There's some relocations going, or have been some relocations going on the air side, but basically it looks like this. On the Russian side, we have their bases, focused on the western side of Russia. There've been a lot of rumors about nuclear weapons in Crimea. I don't think that's the case. I don't think there are nuclear systems that can launch, but I do not think they have nuclear warheads. I've certainly not seen any indication. The same thing goes for Kaliningrad. There's a little pocket there. Lots of rumors about nuclear weapons there. And yes, there are several systems that can deliver nuclear warheads, but as far as I'm hearing from US officials, they do not believe that the Russians have actual nuclear warheads stored there. That leaves storage sites in Russia that you can see here on the site. There are some huge ones up here in Kola. Can you see my cursor when I move?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Up in the Kola Peninsula, there's some significant site, one of the major national sites up there. There's a site here, there's a site down here, couple down here on this side. The point is, a lot of this infrastructure is infrastructure that was built like the Western side during the Cold War. And a lot of it is still in place. We're seeing significant modernizations on the Russian side. Of course, what's generated most interest has been this intermediate range cruise missile that led eventually to the demise of the INF Treaty. And then it is dual capable. And we see, of course, just like on the US and the French and the Chinese side, we see modernizations across the board, upgrading systems from the old Soviet era systems. The Americans have been very tough over the last couple of years on the Russians about increasing their tactical nuclear weapons inventory. We saw that the estimate that the Pentagon came out with was very close to the estimate we had, nearly 2,000 weapons. It varies little depending on who you talk to, how operational they are. The Russians keep saying that, no, we do not have warheads for these systems deployed at the bases. They're in central storage locations. Then we hear that on the American side and NATO side, people saying, yeah, well, but some of those storage sites are pretty close to some of the operational bases. So you have this back and forth and back and forth. But the key issue that's happening now, of course, is that both sides not only are modernizing their forces, but they're also both increasing the way they talk about it. You know, they're rattling the nuclear sword again, and even introducing new types of nuclear weapons, including tactical nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons are coming back to some extent. I do not want to sort of say this is like the Cold War, because it's not. It's very different. Both the dynamic and the circumstances are completely different. Nonetheless, it's a clear power competition where nuclear weapons are used in that play. And now these years we are seeing a renewed emphasis on this. There's even some kind of blurring happening between sort of the categories of what we used to know as tactical and strategic. Just before Christmas, the US deployed a new type of warhead on its ballistic missile submarine. That's a low yield warhead. And that was a weapon they came up with during the nuclear posture review there in 2018. They modified very quickly. And so some of the submarines that are out there now have this on board, and it's intended to be used explicitly early on in a conflict in response to Russia using tactical nuclear weapons. So that's the kind of thinking that's going on and driving all of this stuff right now. So what else can I say? Well, politically on this issue, it's pretty dire in the sense that there are no sort of heavy projects underway to try to change the path of this course. We are in this, as they call it over here, great power competition. And when people say that in the government, that that's the official condition of the relationship we're in, then all the institutions kick into gear. You know, they're like, aha, well, great power competition, that means this. So we're seeing sort of a sharpening of the rhetoric. We're seeing increasing operations, and the operations are becoming more aggressive, closer to each other's territories. And again, like I said, sort of a reinvigoration of the role that nuclear weapons are supposed to play in general, but also specifically here in Europe. So with that, I think I'm just going to hand it over. I mean, it's been like about 10 minutes. Is that correct? So
yes.
If we go on to the next one, if people have questions, we can take it from there.
Thank you so much, Hans. And our idea was to have now some of the nuclear weapons, people from some of the nuclear weapons countries giving an overview about the situation in their countries, and then have a common Q&A. So I would like to give the floor to the counterpart of the United States of America, or to one of the counterparts, to Russia. I'm happy that Oleg Bodrov, who is mainly working on the environmental field and the field of dual-use technology, is joining us. Oleg, the floor is to you to give us an overview about the Russian developments. Oleg, can you hear us?
No.
Okay,
No.
please.
Do you listen me?
Yes, please
Yes.
continue.
Yes, thank you, colleagues. And first of all, I'd like to say thank you, Rainer, because it is my first time when I participated in such kind of the webinar. And I'd like to say about my experience of the communications with my colleagues from peace movement from Baltic Sea countries. Last 6 months, I visited Norway, Finland, and I had many meetings with the peace activists and politicians. And my presentation will be based on such discussion, like result of these discussions. Next slide, please. First of all, I'd like to say about the current Russian reality. First of all, according to Russian president, Russia could be the first to use nuclear weapons. Second, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation said that prohibition of the nuclear weapons contrary to national interest of Russia. At the same time, Russian president, he is supreme commander-in-chief, and he personally launched Russian nuclear triads for transcontinental missiles were launched from the submarines, air and ground-based facilities capable to carry nuclear weapons. It was demonstration of psychological readiness to use the nuclear weapons. In the same time, Russian non-governmental organizations who cooperate with the non-government organization other countries received the status foreign agent. It means that they act against Russian national interests. And the last but not least, there are no peace movement in Russia initiated from grassroots level. Next slide, please. The Russian researcher of the political situation published 6 months ago the report. The name of this report, The Security in the Eastern Baltic. And this is expert from the St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad University. According to the result of this, they conclude that probability of the permanent NATO-Russian confrontation in the Baltic Sea region in the nearest future is 90%. In the same time, the local military conflict between Russia and NATO is 4 times higher than the real effective, difficult and lengthy potential effective negotiation on security and confidence building measures in the region with the code name Helsinki. It means that according to the Russian expert, the risk of the conflict between Russia and NATO in Europe, in Eastern Baltic, is high. Next slide, please. And I think it is very important to say that we have a risk not only nuclear conflict, but if will be any conflict without nuclear weapons, it is high risk of the nuclear contamination in the region because there are too many nuclear, so-called civil nuclear facilities like nuclear power plants. And now we have very different strategy in eastern and the western part of the Baltic Sea region. If the western part of the Baltic region, you can see the green triangles, it is nuclear power plants which is started to decommission process in western part of the Baltic Sea. At the same time, in eastern part of the Baltic Sea, like in Russia and Finland and in Belarus, started to construct new nuclear power plants. And the strategy, the general idea to construct these nuclear power plants, to export the nuclear electricity to the countries which has already started decommission process. So we see that the risks of the nuclear problem, nuclear safety problem, will move from the western to the eastern part of the region. And when interested in detail, the Russia promote the new projects of the nuclear power plant with the new type of the reactor, VVR 1200. And according to the preliminary agreement between Russian State Corporation and Finland, Russia will provide the fresh fuel. It will be monopoly. They will produce the fresh fuel for the nuclear power plant in the Eastern Baltic. From the uranium after the extraction on the reprocessing plant from the nuclear, spent nuclear fuels from the nuclear submarine. If Finnish and Belarusian nuclear power plant, Russian design, will be constructed, it means that all electricity consumers in the Baltic Nordic countries will be investor of the Russian military program, like reprocessing spent fuel rods from the nuclear submarine. So it is not visible process and it is not understandable.
Can you come to an end, please?
Sorry?
Can you come to an end? You're speaking too long.
Okay, next slide, please. So some general ideas of what can we do in the Baltic Nordic countries to create a coalition of the non-governmental organizations for the promotion, demilitarization and denuclearization of the Baltic Sea region. And second, to lobby the equal environmental and public participation standards in Russia and the Baltic Nordic countries. Because for the, I mean the promotion of the so-called civil nuclear industrial project. And next, to organize international conference with the Baltic Nordic region, our common habitat. And the main ideas when I discussed with the people from the Finland and Oslo, it's reasonable if we will promote the cooperation of the regional and municipal authorities and non-governmental organizations cross-border cooperation. So it will be like alternative of the top-level political confrontation. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Oleg, for this highly interesting presentation and the lot of information you passed to us. I'm very happy to welcome now Kate Hudson, the General Secretary of Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. I think we all know that their fight against Trident is one of the most and biggest fights against nuclear weapons we have now. And Kate, the floor is to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Rainer. I've only got a brief time, so I'll go straight in to share with you some of the thinking of CND, its National Council, which met just recently on Zoom, to outline to you our thinking on both the global context and what opportunities or what the current crisis, what that presents for us in terms of nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament. So first of all, we see that we are living in a time of very severe and interlocking crises, some of which have been very well described by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. We have the climate crisis and we have the deep threat of nuclear war. But also, of course, there are related environmental destruction problems. Of course, now the major economic crisis, which is underway and probably going to get a lot worse. And then, of course, the context for all this developing and exacerbating is, of course, the pandemic and the threat to public health. So this has been a big issue for us here in Britain in terms of the relationship between the failure of the government to be prepared in terms of our National Health Service, having insufficient facilities and so on, the relationship of that to nuclear weapons spending. So I'll just outline that just a little bit. We found, like many other countries, that although we're a rich country with a long-standing National Health Service, it is completely unfit for purpose. And we've been absolutely lacking in key equipment, both things like ventilators and, of course, personal protective equipment as well. Now, I think the view is that if no one had expected a pandemic, okay, we could understand that we weren't prepared. But if you look at our national security strategy, you can see that for at least 15 years, probably longer, pandemic threats have been identified by the government as a tier 1 national security threat. And in 2015, it was seen as such an extreme threat that there was actually a biological security strategy outlined 2 years ago under Mrs. May's Prime Ministership. So this has been identified in great detail, and I recommend you to look these up online. So a tier 1 threat to public health and security, massively underfunded in the context of austerity and decades of neoliberalism. At the same time, if you look at those security strategies, you see what's the situation regarding nuclear weapons and nuclear risks and threat. They were actually downgraded to a tier 2 threat. So you can see pandemics tier 1, nuclear weapons tier 2, pandemics, massive cuts in terms of health services, nuclear weapons, £205 billion spent on replacing the nuclear weapons system, you know, which does nothing to meet any of our tier 1 security challenges. And this, I mean, now, well, we've had a very popular slogan, NHS not trident, for the last 10 years under austerity. Now, the whole question of what our national resources have been spent on is really coming to the fore. And it's been also really focused around the question of industrial production as well. The whole question of arms conversion has become a major factor here, as I'm sure it is in many other countries as well. So for decades, we and others in the peace movement have been saying, we need arms conversion, we need to stop producing weapons, we need to start producing socially useful things. And of course, we were always told, no, that's utopian nonsense, don't be ridiculous, you know, that can't be done. But within weeks or days even of the lockdown, the pandemic beginning here in Britain, the government was calling on companies to start producing ventilators instead of other things. First of all, they asked Dyson, which produces vacuum cleaners. Turned out they couldn't do anything that was suitable for COVID-19 patients. And then now there's a consortium of dozens of companies, including around about 7 or 8 arms manufacturers, that are now producing ventilators. Okay, and Barrow, the Barrow shipyard, which is where the submarines are being built, the Trident replacement submarines, they are now producing the visors for the health service, you know, the kind of the big visors to prevent the virus droplets coming on the health workers. And some of those workers are even producing those from home using 3D printers. So it just shows what can be done. And for us, I mean, in Britain, the government is planning what's called an integrated review of our defence and security policies. That has been delayed till later on in the year, so there are opportunities for submission. All the peace organisations and others, of course, are making submissions calling on the government to look at security in a different way, or even to look at what they've said about security and make the national resources fit with what they actually said. You know, so let's spend the money on National Health Service, carers, the caring community and so on. That's what needs to be funding. And there's so much rage here, as I'm sure there is in all your countries, about government mismanagement and all that kind of thing, that there is a real opportunity for us to develop a new narrative which is popular with the people. In fact, the people themselves are driving the new narrative. So as a peace movement, we have to be very receptive and really think outside the box and be creative to make sure that this terrible tragedy of coronavirus, actually there are positive things coming out of it. We see it in terms of social solidarity, but we also now need to see it in terms of a changed approach to security. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Kate. That was an impressive overview about the partly horrible situation in your country, but also, I think, a good view for the future. You know, I'm jumping over the camera and come to France. Our next speaker is a member of parliament in France, Bastien Lachaud. Bastien, the floor is to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank every one of you for being here despite all the troubles we know. I've been asked to tell some words about the French nuclear weapon, so I will. In 2017, Emmanuel Macron was elected as president. Some weeks later, he ordered for a strategic review. Some months later, these guidelines for French security and defense were published. They did not include any change about the nuclear means and strategy. I personally asked his author, Arnaud Danjean, about this. His answer was very clear. Nuclear weapons were not part of his mission. This is a special field in which the French president himself is the only authority. This is the first point I think you should keep in mind about the French nuclear deterrent. This is a topic out of any usual democratic control. Only one man decides. About 1 year later, in 2018, the government passed a law on the upcoming year's army's budgets. According to this, France should spend about 37 billion euros for the next 10 years in order to renew its nuclear arsenal. Yet, some experts state that these measures were not necessary. This is the second point you should remember. As every country holding nuclear weapons, France spends a huge amount of money, and it is very difficult to get information independent of any industrial lobbying. 1 year later, again, at the end of 2019, Emmanuel Macron made a speech about nuclear deterrent in which he introduced very vague and confusing ideas. To say it shortly, according to this speech, the French nuclear arsenal could be shared with other European countries that will be attacked. Actually, it was not confirmed by any other official statement. However, this idea is extremely concerning, especially in a context marked by the end of the INF Treaty and the sharply accelerating arms race. During the 3 last years, France didn't do anything to encourage any negotiation as mentioned in the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation. Moreover, France has urged many of its allies, especially in Africa, to refuse the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. There is almost no public debate on this. Despite the very fast evolution of many new space and cyber technologies, almost no one seems ready in France to assume that nuclear deterrent could be a more and more dangerous strategy than ever. The pandemic crisis we are going through could also have bad consequences. To face the economic crisis, many governments could give us massive support to the arms industry. The aircraft industry is one of the most affected. Increasing military and nuclear spendings could be chosen as a way to save it. No democratic debate, lack of transparency, constantly increasing costs and risks are the main defects of the French nuclear theory. So, we think it is necessary more than ever to engage a sincere global bargain to ban nuclear weapons. This is the reason why my party, France Insoumise, supports the action of ICANN. So we have decided to urge our government to make France an observer state to the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We hope it starts applying as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this speech. I think it was really interesting to know that activities also in France happened. You know, we often were saying France will be the last country which will give up the nuclear weapons, but I'm much more optimistic when I'm listening to you. The last speaker of the first round will be Katrin Vogler, member of the parliament in Germany, member of the Left Party. She is speaking about Germany, which is not a nuclear weapons country, but has nuclear sharing. Katrin, the floor is to you.
Thank you, Rainer, and thank you all for organizing this important event. I should be at New York now, but it's not possible, so maybe we meet there in January. Dear friends and colleagues, in 2010, a vast majority of the German parliament consented on making Germany nuclear weapons free. And in August 2019, this became true. It was executed, and the new US nuclear bombs were withdrawn from Büchel Air Base. You think that I'm cheating? No, it's true. The about 20 nukes which German soldiers have been trained for a nuclear war have been brought back to the US in a C-17 Globemaster aircraft, so that our country was freed from nuclear weapons for 48 hours. Because the nukes came back after 2 days to Germany, and as we know, they have been modernized in the US by a software update, but it's also still possible that the type B61-3 and 61-4 bombs have been or soon will be replaced by the new model B61-12. These new US nukes are not only more efficient and flexible in targeting and explosive power, they are also shelter breaking, which makes them suitable for first strike use, according to NATO nuclear strategy. So in Germany, as you see, things have changed a lot in the last 10 years. The coalition treaty between social and Christian Democrats ruling our country, it still demands for a nuclear-free world, but it describes not one only step into that direction. In opposite, there are frequently demands from conservative side of the political sphere that Germany, alone or together with France, should become a nuclear weapons power itself to minimize the dependency on a US government which is seen as erratic and not reliable in international affairs. Today, we had a press conference on the SIPRI data on military spending in 2019, and we see that Germany, with 10% increase, has the biggest increase of military spendings among all leading industrial countries. And this is a shame. According to our federal government, this is to continue. And our Minister for Defense, Mrs. Kramp-Karrenbauer, she's actually been on a shopping tour for 145 new bombing aircrafts for the Bundeswehr, 30 of which will be used for the nuclear share within NATO. And as we know, the German government, especially our Office on Foreign Affairs, did and does a great job in deterring other countries from joining the ban treaty. I am glad to hear that they are not as successful as they wanted to be, because more and more states are joining the ban treaty, but we must see that it's a real important thing that we fight against the politics of our government trying to deter other countries to sign the treaty. There are also some positive things I can inform you about. To support the idea of the global ban treaty, I founded a parliamentary inter-party group of friends of the nuclear ban in the German parliament. This group is open for all active and former MPs of democratic parties, and it has now about 30 or 40 members of different parties, also from the ruling parties, although they are under massive pressure in their own parties that they support the idea. So we are networking with cities and federal states that have signed the Icon Cities Appeal, because we see this as an important tool to put pressure on the ruling parties and the government. And we also cooperate with peace groups and NGOs in order to build a broad coalition against nuclear weapons in Germany, because we see that many people do not really know that there are nuclear weapons still in Germany, and they don't know that they are going to be modernized, which means this is a sort of aggressive act. So last thing I want to point out is that we have seen an interesting move of the position of the big two Christian churches, which is very hopeful for me, especially the Catholic Church, which always stated that nuclear weapons are only ethically acceptable when they are used for deterrence and not for aggression. They and that they also obliged the owner to do something for disarmament. They now changed their position and stated that under the actual conditions, they see nuclear arms not longer as ethical acceptable. And so we think maybe we got new partners in our fight, which we continue, that Germany one day will really be for more than 48 hours nuclear weapons free and join the ban treaty.
Thank you, Katrin. This was the last speaker for our first round, and we have now about 50 minutes for question and answers. And I saw one hand, and this is the hand from Sue. So Sue, please raise your question or your short comment, and can I ask all of you to be so short as possible?
I was going to ask Oleg or you, if there's anybody in this peace movement or this negotiating movement. I mean, there's people in the German parliament who are interested in disarmament. Is there any involvement in the two arsenals facing each other on the Chinese border? Okay. Do any of you know?
Can maybe I pass this question to Hans? Hans, can you give an answer to this question about China?
Microphone's off.
He's muted.
Muted.
Sorry about that. I can talk in general about China, but what was the specific angle? I mean, I didn't get the particular.
Is there any negotiating going on between Russia and China about this, the two arsenals facing each other on the border?
As far as I know, no. However, of course, there is interaction going on between between Moscow and Beijing on closer collaboration on a number of issues. But I think that is more a development that's happening as a result of the way the two countries see their position vis-a-vis the United States. So they're sort of, trying to stick together, if you will, rather than an indication of some newfound friendship. There's a long history of deep suspicion between Russia and China, also because they've had a couple of border incidents over the years. So I don't think this should be seen as some kind of deeper trend between the two, but it's a practical arrangement they have for now. But it's not something that relates to nuclear weapons negotiations or limits on that or something like that. Not as far as I'm aware, at least. Sorry about that.
All right.
Thank you, Hans, for this. You know, I cannot see any more questions, so we can use the time for have a longer discussion at the end after all the speeches. And I would love to give the floor now to Daniel. Daniel from ICANN. You know, I think in this group I have not explained about ICANN. Daniel, I'm happy that you could make it today. The floor is to you.
Well, thank you very much, Rainer. First of all, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, thank you very much, and thanks to IPB for organizing this, and thanks, of course, for having ICANN here. It's always a pleasure. I've been asked to speak about the tracks for progress in Europe as it relates to the TPNW, and I'm just going to jump right in for the sake of time. But just to start in kind of general terms, as I'm sure many of you know very well, the ICANN network, the ICANN family, and our fellows, allies out there working very hard to bring about the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, which I'm very happy to have heard referenced many times here already today. Reaching that threshold of 50 ratifications required for entry into force is significant, both from a legal, a practical, and also a campaigning perspective. So that's one track of the campaign, which is working with the states that are supportive of the principles of the treaty, and doing what we can to encourage, assist, and advise them to get their signatures and ratifications done as quickly as possible. So that's a lot of energy that's devoted to that from the ICANN side. But as is abundantly clear, and as you all know very well, not all governments want to be encouraged, assisted, or advised to join the TPNW. So another track of our campaign is to change the political dynamics around the question of nuclear weapons in the states that possess nuclear weapons or are complicit in the possession and continued deployment of nuclear weapons. And as we all know very well, also is that the highest concentration of these complicit states is in Europe. So it's no secret either that NATO states have increasingly started to act in lockstep as it concerns nuclear weapons, and the TPNW in particular. While there was always some skepticism from NATO states, to say the least, over the last several years of this process that became known as the Humanitarian Initiative, there was actually always a gradient of positions as it concerned the idea of illegal prohibition and the idea of highlighting the humanitarian consequences in general. You had, of course, in 2013, some states who were even leading this humanitarian consequences initiative, and privately being supportive of taking the next steps of developing a new legal instrument. I don't want to talk too much about that recent history, but I think it is instructive to know that the unity that we're seeing now from NATO states in Europe was not necessarily inevitable or obvious. So governments have changed. Of course, many of the allies in NATO that we worked with in those early days changed. Politics in Europe has been turbulent, to say the least. And of course, there is the ever-present factor of the United States and also France and the UK, who several other speakers here have already noted, have sought to bully other states, and in particular their NATO allies and NATO Partnership for Peace partners as well, to hold a strict line when it comes to nuclear weapons and the TPNW. And also, ironically, I think it seems that the Trump administration's overt hostility towards NATO as an institution and to NATO members for their military spending shortcomings has actually led NATO states to retreat into their shells even more, and both to capitulate to the rhetoric coming out of Washington, and also to make sure they don't rock the boat when it comes to the TPNW. Be interesting to hear others' views about that in the comments. And Rainer, feel free to just shout at me if I go over time here. Totally comfortable with that. So just on that NATO point, it's clear that there's significant coordination and information sharing coming out of NATO headquarters. You hear the same talking points coming out of the mouth of a politician in Oslo as you do in Athens. So there's clearly that kind of message sharing and strong push for message discipline that's coming out of, I think, coordinated by NATO officials. This doesn't take us by surprise, of course, that this unity would develop. That old analogy about you can't expect the smokers to lead the effort on banning smoking also applies here, of course. So what we have to do is be creative, be impatient. I think that's very important. ICANN has never been known for being a patient campaign, and I think that's to our credit. And also continue, very importantly, to continue to make the humanitarian case. There are so many lessons to be learned from this COVID-19 crisis and tragedy. But clearly, the idea that we ignore the warnings from the scientific and expert community at our own peril is one of those. And Kate Hudson put that very well in her section at the start.
Daniel,
so I don't think
one more minute.
One more minute. Okay. Let's just skip ahead then. I'll skip all the compliments of people. I was going to compliment Katrine Vogler as well for mentioning the two projects that ICANN is intimately involved in, with this, which is the ICANN Cities Appeal and the Parliamentary Pledge. And perhaps I'll end with talking about this, the importance of asking the question. We saw earlier this year in January, perhaps this flew under the radar greatly, and that's because it kind of came out of the blue. But there was a vote in the Belgian Parliament, in a very clear vote that was put forward by a party called SPA. And that vote was clearly about Belgium signing the TPNW and removing nuclear weapons from Kleine-Vogel, the base there. And that vote, it was defeated. I mean, our side was defeated, but only 5 votes. If only 5 votes had switched sides, then it would have passed. And while the legal implications of what that would have meant going forward aren't exactly clear, it shows that this kind of unity, this lockstep, this block that we see is not as strong as the other side would like us to believe that it is. So I would just leave with that, and perhaps I can get into a little bit more in the discussion. Is that we have to be aggressive about putting that question before policymakers as often as possible, because we know and we see that when politicians are asked this question, they get extremely uncomfortable, and it's very hard for them to side with nuclear weapons against it. So I'm sorry for going on a little bit, but thank you very much, Rainer, again for inviting me here.
No, thank you, Daniel, for joining, and I think we will come back to some of your questions in the discussion. The next speaker, and I'm very happy that he could make it, is Owen Tudor, the Deputy General Secretary of the International Trade Unions Confederation. And we are so happy that we have ITUC as a new big partner in the boat against nuclear weapons. Owen, the floor is to you.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Rainer, and colleagues. I'm pleased to demonstrate once again the trade union movement's commitment to peace, and in particular to nuclear disarmament in this 75th anniversary year of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I represent more than 200 million trade union members globally, and our pan-European organisation stretches from Reykjavik to Vladivostok. Our members join unions because they recognise that talking is better than fighting. Tomorrow, on International Workers' Memorial Day, unions around the world will be calling for workplace safety measures, especially in health and social care. On May Day this Friday, we will be calling for action on jobs, incomes and social protection during and after the pandemic crisis. We face the real prospect at the moment around the world, on top of the lives lost, of 200 million more unemployed, up to 250 million starving, and 500 million thrown back into poverty. But we mustn't lose sight, while tackling the pandemic, of the need to stop the escalation of nuclear weapons and the growth in military expenditure. These struggles are inextricably linked. We must contrast what is happening to military spending and what is needed to tackle the pandemic. We want social protection in the trade union movement to provide social justice for all, to tackle inequality within and between nations, between genders and across ages, thus removing many of the causes of conflict around the world and making it easier to prevent and defeat future pandemics. A global social protection fund for the poorest 20% of countries would cost just $7 billion a year. That's less than half of 1% of the 1.9 trillion annual global military expenditure, according to SIPRI's figures released today. Indeed, it's only 10% of the increase in military expenditure over the previous year. The money being spent on nuclear weapons and the military should be devoted to health and care, to reconstruct our damaged economies, to build real security for people. European governments in particular should stop stockpiling mid-range nuclear weapons and recommit to the INF Treaty. Of course, not all union members think like this. We represent people because they work, not because of their political views. We also represent the people who make nuclear and other weapons, and in some countries, even the military themselves. So we have a particular ask of the peace movement to put just transition at the heart of your policies. Originally conceived as part of our climate agenda, just transition means that where jobs are lost through disarmament, they should be replaced by jobs using equivalent skills and providing decent wages negotiated with unions. This concept was at the heart of an initiative that happened where and when I grew up in the UK of the 1970s. The union reps at Lucas Aerospace developed a workers' plan to save jobs threatened by the loss of orders for fighter planes by converting to manufacturing socially useful goods like kidney dialysis machines. When unions are calling for workers to be redeployed to manufacture ventilators and other medical equipment, there couldn't be a better example of the case for beating swords into plowshares. The ventilators that are in such short supply around the world cost up to $50,000 each. Last year's increase in military expenditure would pay for at least 1 million of them. Our members should be manufacturing for recovery and resilience, not for death and destruction. We must tackle the really big challenges of poverty, inequality, and climate change rather than spending trillions preparing for war. To manage that transition, we need to convince voters and politicians to change direction. And in particular, we need to fix the broken multilateral system that is failing us on the pandemic and on peace. We welcomed the UN Secretary General's appeal to the G20 for a global ceasefire, but there's been too little global leadership on the pandemic or on peace. So our demands should include national governments spending our money wisely and working together globally. The NPT review conference that should have been taking place this week in New York must be rescheduled. We must make progress on the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We must say yes to converting military spending to social investment and no to nuclear weapons. Solidarity.
Thank you, Owen, very, very much for this impressive speech. And thank you for mentioning on one side the need for conversion and to mention the actual SIPRI figures, which I think are horrible figures when you are looking to the situation of the world, poverty and hunger. The next speaker is coming from the Netherlands, from PAX, Susie Schneider, an old activist of the peace movement and the anti-nuclear weapons movement. Susie, the floor is to you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen here, I believe. Great, because I'm sure nobody really wants to watch me so much, but instead look at the bits and pieces of information that have been put together. I'm really happy that there's been a number of speakers who have brought up issues around the private sector, around companies, and you know, both Kate, Bastian mentioned the private sector, and I think it's important to look at the private sector and their lobbyists that do help drive the decisions around the continued production of nuclear weapons. What you see here are the companies that are involved in producing key components for the French nuclear arsenal. And some of these companies are also now being pushed into this just transition, as Kate mentioned, and Owen, I'm so glad that you brought this up as well. It's something that we talk about a lot, into doing things that support an end to, or support producing the correct things for helping the COVID crisis. So Airbus in particular has been quite involved in that, and there are some others. So these are the companies that are involved in the French arsenal. You'll also see, hopefully, there we go. The companies involved in the UK arsenal. Now, the thing is, in the UK, I know it's often talked about the UK as, at least within UK press, as the independent nuclear deterrent. And I just want to basically blow that myth up, because the fact of the matter is the United States does a significant amount of the contracting for the UK Trident system. In fact, when I look at the contracts are made by the United States government to be paid in part by the UK government. And so contracts with companies like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, or General Dynamics, we see that a lot in relation to the Trident system. So I just want to, let's eradicate the myth of independence when it comes to the UK arsenal, because it's a whole load of not truth. Sorry, I realize I don't want to swear on a recorded webinar. Anyway, companies involved in the UK arsenal. Again, it's good to know who you're dealing with and who we are dealing with. And then it was mentioned, Hans brought this up, and others mentioned as well, the B-61 bombs and the modernization, so-called modernization project around the B-61. Boeing is the biggest driver and the key contractor for the new guided tail kit for the B-61 bombs. But there are other private companies, Boeing, Huntington Ingalls Industries, and Honeywell International, that are directly involved in this. And I think, again, it's important to be aware of the companies behind the bomb. It's one of the things that we produce. We're the only independent research out there that puts this list of companies, and our new list of producers will be out very soon. But I want to get to the fact that it is not all bad, because these are companies involved in European nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons stored in Europe. But then when it comes to those who resist nuclear weapons from a financial private sector standpoint, European financial institutions are actually leading the way. And they're the ones who are rejecting predominantly investment in production of nuclear weapons and the companies that produce nuclear weapons. We found 36 financial institutions which have the cream of the crop, the absolute best of the best in terms of policies that prohibit any type of investment in any type of nuclear weapons. And of those 36 institutions, 31 of them are European based. And now this has power, because it is the European financial institutions rejecting producers of cluster munitions from their portfolios that got Lockheed Martin, one of the largest arms manufacturers on the planet, to say, no, we will not do this again. It's European financial institutions watchdogged by civil society organizations like ours that got Orbital ATK to say, no, no, no. Even when the Trump administration came back to them and said, we want to make more cluster bombs, they said, no, we will be blacklisted from European investment. We cannot do that. Europe has power in building these norms, and norms matter. It is overall, we started dumping the bomb and we saw about 30 policies around the investment of nuclear weapons. Now we see 77. Pension funds in particular have been changing their policies rapidly and forcefully to reject any type of investment. And this is where partnerships with the labor unions in particular are very, very potent. In the Netherlands, it's almost across the board when it comes to pension funds that have rejected investment in nuclear weapon producers. And that demonstrates that society, that people do not want their money, they do not want their retirement to be dependent on building something that is an existential threat. And the last thing, which I'll end on, is that one of the great things about Don't Bank the Bomb is that everybody can do something. People often feel disempowered by nuclear weapons, and the debate for decades has led It would be very disempowering. I mean, if you're not an expert in physics or chemistry, or you're not a political scientist, well, what can you really do? Well, through Don't Bank on the Bomb, we have something everyone can do. You can find your own investments. You can advocate for good policies in your institutions, your organizations. If you're connected or funded by a foundation, are their investments doing well? It's a nice discussion to have with your donors. It's also an easy thing that anybody can call up their bank and say, hey, I'd love to talk to you about nuclear bombs because I think they're wrong and I don't want our money to touch it. So I'll leave it there and say thanks for inviting me here. It's been great.
Thank you, Susie, for this impressive talk. And the last speaker will be the chair of the International Peace Bureau, Philip Jennings. Philip, the floor is to you.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. What I'll try and do is try and draw some of the strings together. And just to remind people that this, I know we were all supposed to be in New York. And in fact, Friday and Saturday, we were supposed to be at the Riverside Church. And the Riverside Church was a place where Martin Luther King made 8 speeches during his life. And one of the most controversial, and I think one of the best speeches he made was in the church on the 4th of April, 1967, and the theme of his talk was Beyond Vietnam, and that silence was betrayal. And I refer back to that speech and ask you all to read that speech again, because we can't remain silent, and remaining silent this time will be betrayal. And what he also talked about was the urgency of now. So in pulling together all the various strings and organizations that we represent, no silence, and we have to be urgent. Not much reference has been made to SIPRI today. This is a bad news day. Dark and distressing. Global military expenditure is at an all-time high, 1.9 trillion. As we're in this race to find treatment for COVID-19, we have an arms race taking place, which is undermining all of those efforts. We have to say that we are basically fighting the wrong war. Now, the SIPRI statistics are very telling. I know the theme of today is Europe, but let me just dig them out for you. Germany, Rainer, a 10% increase. I mean, Catherine, the whole parliament and our friends on the Labour side must be up in the arms about this. Europe is 5% higher, 365 billion. Arms expenditure, military expenditure, sorry, in Europe is almost 10% higher than the year 2010. And worldwide, Europe accounts for 90% of global military spending. The European Union, from the Lisbon Treaty, now has a kind of European Defence Union. It has its own European Defence Agency. It has a whole list of various European Union institutions, which are meant to be talking about peace, but they don't. But they talk about enhanced defence and security, talk of EU armies and God knows what. But at the same time, there is very little public discussion. There is silence when it comes to what the European Union dimension to this conversation is all about. I'd like to thank Hans and Oleg for their conversations, and it just makes you more, how can I put it, that it gives you more of a sense of an urgency and the need to do something. Now, we have to build back better. I know that this is a term that is coming into currency, and please, we must learn the lessons from how we dealt with the 2008 financial crisis. I remember with Owen and myself and union leaders at that time, we extracted promises from world leaders at the G20 in 2007, 2008, and 2009 that things would be different. And then maybe we took them at their word, but the political environment, the political winds changed, and all those promises did not materialize. Therefore, in this moment now, in the urgency of now, in building back better, there has to be a number of pillars to what it is that we are seeking to do. We're talking about change economic thinking. We're talking about how we deal with climate change. Owen's talked about the social contract and social protection and the importance of workers' rights. But please, can we bring into this conversation a pillar for peace? Kate talked about changing the narrative and the outrage that people have that the money that is being spent in the wrong way. Can we develop this narrative? Can we bring in a new era of peace? Can we, with all the energy that we have, try to bring a peace dividend into this conversation? And however naive that sounds, I think there's something in it in terms of trying to develop that change narrative. I think it requires activism at NATO. Now that Daniel needs our help, all of us, to change that narrative. We have to be stronger, I think, in terms of what NATO is about and what it's trying to do. Stronger in terms of the EU institutions. We have to lay a glove on them in how this evolution of a European Defence Union goes. We need to use this time. Perhaps it was a blessing that the NPT didn't take place now. As the SIPRI figures show us, as Hans has talked and Oleg has talked about these new fault lines, these new expenses, it means that we have to be much more aggressive on our approach to the NPT on Article 6, and also to put our shoulder to the wheel for the work, the brilliant work that ICANN is doing for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And also, Susie, there are 30 companies only that are part of the process to manufacture nuclear weapons, according to an IPB seminar last week. Now, this is not beyond us in terms of laying a glove on them for the people who invest in them to stop the investment. The IPB is the most ancient. I am the newest face in the IPB, more or less. We've been around an awful long time. We have a Nobel Peace Prize from 1910. Never was our work more important. We know that we have this great constellation. We have many stars in the sky in our movement. But goodness me, we have to pull our energies together. We have to put our efforts together to change this narrative and to build back better. Every speech we must say, build back better. This COVID-19 calls upon us to change so many fundamental things, and peace has to be part of build back better. I know in 2022 is the 40th anniversary of the Palmer Report on common security. We do need another discussion about our common security, about what it means. At the IPB, we called for a global ceasefire. Unfortunately, within hours, I'm not taking credit for this at the IPB, but the UN Secretary General said exactly the same thing. Can we build on that notion of a global ceasefire to make it permanent, to make it real, to become another period of détente? We know, Owen, when he's at the G20, we know how toxic the relations have become between the US and China. We know how toxic the relations are between the US and China and elsewhere. This is not sustainable. Therefore, we have to use the efforts and the voice and the narrative that we have to bring a place of détente, that we can develop another notion of common security, maybe a global commission as well as is worthy of consideration. But to build back better, we need to add that peace dividend and that peace pillar and that peace dimension to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for these words, which are showing what we have to do and what are our challenges we are facing. The floor is to all of you. You can now raise your hands and we will give you the floor for questions and answers and comments. I also ask all the speakers to comment whenever they want. So please, the floor is open. Oh, okay. You see someone?
Everybody's on mute.
Yeah. No one wants to speak. Oh yeah, Ruth. the floor is to Ruth. Can you mute her?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Ruth.
Hi, I assume everybody is just so overwhelmed by the amazing talks that we heard. Thank you all so much. I actually came prepared with a question, and it's kind of been answered by Kate a little bit, but I was wondering whether representatives from other countries might want to weigh in on the question how this COVID-19 pandemic could sort of impact our understanding of the narrative of human security, because now there's a lot of talk, I guess, about it again as an overlooked concept, in the sense that we're over-militarizing and not funding the NHS, for example, enough. Yeah. And so I guess my question is, do you see any potential that this crisis could reshape patterns or like set pathways, you know, and set them back onto a more peaceful track? What are your takes on the opportunities in your countries?
Who from the speakers want to reply?
Who's there? Am I still on?
Please, Philip.
Steve, thank you for the question. Let's take it as amidst the tragedy and the loss of 200,000 lives and the failure of governments and the failure of the economic thinking, which has driven the weakness and weakening of the ability of governments and our health services to deal with this crisis. Let's see this as an opportunity. But it's up to us to do it. This won't just happen. The anger will maybe subside. So I think, Ruth, this idea of building back better, we have to be persistent. We have to be loud. And we have to try to change the public conversation and the political conversation that this has been such a dramatic lesson for the world that we want to show that another world is possible. And that world has to be without nuclear weapons. That world has to mean a decrease in the $2 trillion almost, which is spent. As far as I've looked at the data, what would it cost for a vaccine? A vaccine, according to CEPI, would cost $2 billion. That's 0.1% of what the world spends on its military. But Ruth, it calls upon all those climate change activists. It calls upon all those human rights activists, all the trade union movement and ourselves to raise our voice. We can have a 10-point manifesto, and then we can do what NATO is doing and drive that down the throats of every political friend that we've got on the planet. And I think we have this huge opportunity to do this. But as we noticed in 2008 with the financial crisis, time travels quickly, memories slip away, commitments get lost in terms of the drama. So therefore, let's use this as an opportunity to build. Thank you.
Thank you. I have 3 more speakers. The next one is Daniel.
Hi there. I actually had a question myself, but I mean, since you've given me the floor, maybe I'll just reply quickly. I don't really have anything to add specifically to what Kate mentioned earlier, which I thought was brilliant, and what Phil just said right then. But just to highlight that, you know, the military industry, the military industrial complex is already anticipating what we're saying right now about how we need to reprioritize where financing goes to. I saw a study from the German government-affiliated think tank, which made precisely this point, which made we expressed fear about, well, we shouldn't go back to that situation that we were in after 2008, after the financial crisis. You know, that was a disaster for the defense industry. We have to get out early and start to make these arguments about how it's not defense spending versus, you know, humanitarian spending or spending on essential services. The two can work together. And as you know, I think we all know, given the amount that's going into the defense industry, the two are cannot coexist. We have to make a choice. We have to prioritize essential services. You know, right now, as we see, during dire straits, and we cannot emphasize as much on military spending. So maybe I'll save my question until maybe
Please.
others who have
Yes.
got a chance to respond.
Catherine?
Thank you, Rainer. Thank you, Daniel. It's just what I wanted to point out. It's the other side is already discussing how they can safeguard their privileges, and they are preparing for the day after. And so we have to do. So we have to do the networking now, and we have to do the argumentation and the discussion in public now to be prepared for that moment after. We are not. We cannot wait until the situation has calmed, but it's now, it's the moment where we have to join in the public debate. In Germany, the military is already preparing for the moment, and they are doing a lot of social charity things just to be present in the public. Which is their advantage. They can do that because they are acting in official in their official task, and we cannot act in the public as we are used to. So we have to find new ways, new media, and new formats of debating this in the public and networking with all the groups that were mentioned.
Kate, thank you. Catherine, and Kate is the next.
Just to absolutely agree with what Philip said about this, you know, it's down to us, and will be a small window of opportunity where change can be brought about. And Philip mentioned a few times this term, build back better. And CND, I'm pleased to say, is involved in a big alliance initiative in Britain, which is temporarily at least called Build Back Better. I'm hoping we're going to remain Build Back Better, but it's many different civil society organisations, NGOs and all that. There's us, there's Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, all kinds of development organisations and so on, getting together. So we have common principles, and then we elaborate the own detail around our own field of work. So I think being in alliance now, working together with others to make sure we make the most of that opportunity, it's absolutely key.
Thank you, Kate. The next is Hans. Hans, thank you so much for all the information you put into the Zoom chat. The floor is to you.
Great, thanks. On the question about effects of the current situation, yes, there's no doubt, of course, that it's going to have a huge impact on nuclear spending, nuclear programs, but also in the short term. Let me take the long term first. In the United States, of course, there's a clear expectation that defense budgets will suffer, all government expenditures will suffer, but also about sustainability, because of what's happening now is that not only is the economy going, south, as we say, but what's happening is also that the deficit is increasing enormously. So the financial ability of countries to sustain these enormous expenditures is without doubt going to be challenged. But there's a particular phenomenon I just want to mention, which is that in the very short term, ironically, what we're seeing is an attempt to sort of rush certain programs forward because they know full well, for example, that in November, the United States is going to have an election, and it's very likely that we will see a new Democratic administration. But we also see that when this budget crunch is happening, they're afraid that the combination of both the presidential election that could shift the policies and then far fewer funds to be able to fund with these things, that's causing them now to try to rush certain programs through, to get a program of record underway so that it'll be harder for the next administration to cancel it. So we see that in the terms of the new nuclear cruise missile, for the air-launched cruise missile. We see it on the selection of contractors. We sort of very blatantly see the Pentagon choosing single contractors, just to, to get things going quickly. Just say, all right, well, we choose this one without finishing the contracting process. So it's sort of a blatant example, you could say, of desperation and fear of what's going to be coming just, less than 6 months down the road.
Rainer, you're on mute.
So thank you, Hans, and thank you all of you, for joining this webinar. I think it was a highly interesting webinar with a lot of information, and shows how needed we are and how urgent are common activities. And that brings me to the point, I hope to see all of you, or many of you, again in January 2020 in New York at the NPT conference. I hope at that time the NPT conference will happen. And between, I think we should continue discussing many points which were raised by the speakers on different webinars. I think it's urgent that we are continuing our discussion, that we really develop a plan of actions and activities for using the chance which is in the crisis. And thank you so much for joining in the afternoon, and I wish all of you a very nice morning, Hans, a very nice day, and a very nice afternoon and evening in Europe. Thank you so much. Again, away.